We're here today to present the update on the state of science for the second half of the year. So we will spend a lot of time talking today about the data that really matters and the implications that you might see for you and your team. I'm joined today by Erin Legwold, one of our star strategists and author of this report, as well as Natalie LaFranzo, our VP of Strategy.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kristin, for kicking us off. Erin and I are so excited to be back to share an update on the state of the industry. We have some interesting updates to the market signals that we saw earlier in the beginning of 2024. And so we'll start today by previewing our key findings that will anchor our discussion. We'll briefly review the demographics and the methodologies behind the work so you understand the perspectives from which the data was collected. Then Erin and I are going to tag team two sections of data on priorities and productivity and the industry's perception on the economy and the impact it will have on their work. We'll wrap up by revisiting those key findings that we start with and then field any questions that you might have. So as you may know, our twice-a-year State of Science data represents an important facet of the work that we do at Linus. As strategy, growth, and innovation consultants, we're always looking to understand the environment that our partners operate in. So whether you're selling to pharma, academics, or both audiences, being responsive to that dynamic environment and the pressures that our audiences are facing can make our brands and products more impactful and memorable. And as always, our time together today represents a snapshot of the data that we've collected. So if your team would be interested in a more tailored individual session, please reach out and we can certainly present some additional insights to you. So let's get started with those key findings. First, you may remember that in early 2024, we saw a strong focus and investment in automation. So we at Linus predicted that this signaled that the industry was preparing to transition to artificial intelligence tools, but needed to lay the foundation before that was feasible. So now we're seeing that transition continue, with AI integration becoming even more important to our audience. That said, we're also seeing an interesting distinction between generative AI and AI informatics tools. The terms AI and machine learning still feel a bit nebulous to this audience, but the impact and trustworthiness of these two different applications has very important differences that we should be aware of that may impact positioning and messaging for these tools. Related to this, but more broadly, trust continues to be a critical lever in connecting with the scientific community. We'll share more about where trust is lacking, how that impacts our audience, and what we can do to build trust. Another prediction we made in early 2024 was the continued advancement of multiomics. We're seeing this signal strengthen, and we'll discuss how this focus impacts both purchasing and partnerships. And finally, related to the economy, we're seeing some stabilization occur globally. Importantly, this means that the economy is no longer as influential in how scientists are viewing their priorities for the remainder of the year. So for each of these key findings, we'll talk about the underlying data and then how it may influence your strategic decisions. As always, the results we present for State of Science are both timely and intentionally represent a broad audience. Specifically, we surveyed 395 respondents between the end of May and mid-June of this year. From a geographic perspective, our respondents are primarily from North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific, with representation from South and Central America and the Middle East and Africa. And our cohort is split primarily between academia and pharma, with representation as well from contract research, manufacturing, and non-therapeutic biotech. Our respondents span multiple job functions from research scientists to executive leaders. So with that introduction, let's dive more deeply into the data. So as I mentioned, we'll start our deep dive with a focus on the priorities and productivity our audience has identified as important. Relative to the results that we shared earlier this year, the priorities of the industry remain generally unchanged, with AI integration, adoption of new technologies, and fostering relationships for new collaborations being top of mind. That said, there are some interesting nuances that we'll explore more deeply. There are 4 key indicators we're going to highlight in this section. First, as I alluded to earlier, we're seeing an interesting shift from purchase intent moving from larger investment in automation that we saw in early 2024 to an increase in purchase intent for AI tools. But we're not yet seeing the return on that investment yet, especially in academia. So 61% of those respondents working in academia predict that their productivity will be slightly lower than what they had hoped to achieve in 2024. And then related to trust, we'll discuss 2 specific sources of information that scientists are leaning into. The first is the continued reliance on peer-reviewed publications as a source of trustworthy information for all respondents. And then interestingly, we see a 20 percentage point difference between industry and academia related to presentations and panels, with biopharma more strongly seeing these speaking engagements as a trustworthy source of information. So the first key indicator in this section arose from our respondents predicting what techniques will be most impactful to the life science R&D sector this year. Here you can see the distinction I mentioned related to AI and ML applied in two very different ways. At the top, respondents see the potential of AI or ML enabled bioinformatics tools, followed then by the potential of more predictive modeling techniques. And I ask you to remember this distinction when we begin talking about trusted sources of information and the impact that terminology may have on our audience perceptions. One other interesting point to call out on this slide, this was the first time that we included personalized therapeutics in this question, and it came forward as the third most impactful application or technique likely to make an impact. So something to keep an eye on in the industry. So back to our AI story. When we look at how the priorities for our respondents have changed between now and earlier this year, we see a slightly more fragmented set of responses when compared to January, but still a strong prioritization of AI. And when we parse this by type of organization, we see similar prioritization, with academia having a slightly higher interest in prioritizing AI and ML. This may be driven by the freedom and flexibility that's afforded by the academic environment to explore new tools and technologies, but it's also likely that industry is looking to tap into the opportunities for innovation and the streamlining of manual processes that AI promises. And this point is further defined by our next set of results. So when we look back at the rankings for technology purchases that we saw earlier this year, automated systems were ranked #1, with AI tied in the rankings for third. Now, we've seen that purchase intent shift, with AI moving up and automated systems trending downward. This further supports our hypothesis from January that automation is really an entry point for the adoption of AI. Further aligning with this, we're seeing the barriers to AI adoption begin to decline in significance. So inflated expectations around AI and ML have dropped, no longer falling in the top 5 barriers. And challenges associated with accessing training data for these tools has also dropped, again, perhaps due to standardization afforded by automation that has been invested in. So we'll revisit AI later in the presentation, but to sum up the story for now, these signals certainly indicate that progress towards adoption of technology could absolutely change the way science is done. So if we go back to our purchase intent rankings, we were also heartened to see the rise of sequencer to the top. And while DNA sequencing alone has become a cornerstone of life science research, this year has had some important milestones related to sequencing technologies. Worthy of note are 2 platforms that are redefining how we think about sequencing. In fact, in January, Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology News predicted that 2024 would be a landmark year for NGS, and this has certainly proved true. With platforms such as Singular's G4X and Elements of ED24 hitting the market, the term sequencer is no longer just defined by a sequencer. Both platforms promise to deliver a true multi-omics characterization in a way that had been previously inaccessible. At Linus, we're keeping a close eye on what this means not only for the NGS market, but for other markets that may be impacted by this evolution of what a sequencer can deliver. Further supporting this movement, when we revisit our prioritization data, we see the adoption of new techniques to acquire new data at the top of the list. And while this represents an exciting step forward for scientific advancement, there are still some challenges that the industry is facing. In what certainly felt like an unexpected extension of a tumultuous year for fundraising and employment, we included the option of instability in the job market as a potential barrier. 25% of our respondents selected this in their top 3 barriers, and it now enters our analysis tied for the topmost barrier. Interestingly, this is even more keenly felt by those in academia, who place employment challenges slightly above the respondents in pharma and biopharma. And we heard that this isn't just impacting their outlook, it's impacting productivity. When we asked, unaided, why productivity would be lower or similar, we saw a myriad of answers related to job market conditions. You'll see that these responses range from decreasing headcount to challenges finding skilled candidates, spanning both academia and industry. And as we mentioned earlier, unfortunately, in academia, this general sentiment around stagnancy and what they'll accomplish for the remainder of the year is a very strong signal, with 61% of academic respondents selecting unchanged or lower productivity than anticipated for 2024. And this is mirrored by a decline in 17 percentage points in the academic respondents who report confidence in their ability to meet their productivity goals, dropping from 74% in January to 57% for the remainder of the year. For this audience, publications and funding are central to their definitions of productivity, and their priorities are aligned with accomplishing these key tasks. Specifically, when compared to their colleagues in pharma, academics are more likely to be seeking collaborations or partnerships, adopting new techniques, and recruiting more scientists to join their team. So when we're thinking about communicating with this audience, ensuring that we're matching our messaging with their priorities is very important. And while these collaborations are clearly very important to academia, across all of our respondents, we saw that finding new collaborations and external partnerships remains a top priority for the remainder of the year, following on that strong signal that we saw related to this in January. And these collaborations and partnerships are beautifully aligned with the application areas where our respondents see the biggest opportunity for scientific advancement. If you're a technology developer or a solution provider in these areas, we're thrilled to emphasize the opportunity you have to meet the needs of scientists by helping them advance these priorities that they've identified. Importantly, however, as Erin will be expanding on, to facilitate these relationships, you must not only demonstrate technical specifications and performance, but also help address barriers related to trust.
Great. So yes, at this point, we had a better understanding of what scientists will be prioritizing in the next 6 months, and their expectations for productivity as well. And there's also this kind of broader influence that's affecting scientists' approaches and their sentiments. And yeah, that is that trust story. And at the beginning of this year, you might remember that Linus released our 6 trends that we predicted would have a significant impact on the life science industry. And one of them was the erosion of trust and the kind of associated importance of building it back. And we're really seeing that come to life as we're moving into the second half of this year. So scientists are telling us that some of the most influential barriers in life sciences will be related to trust. And also because, like Natalie told us, they're prioritizing new partners, they're prioritizing new collaborations. And so it's important for these potential partners to really be aware that trust is going to be critical in connecting with scientific audiences in the rest of this year. So the first trust-related barrier that our scientists are experiencing is the politicization of scientific topics. And again, you might remember that when we conducted this study in January, we had asked about politicization of science as a barrier for the very first time. And for our audience, it was, immediately one of the top 5 barriers in all of life science. And so we're seeing a similar proportion selecting politicization as a top barrier. And that's especially impactful for our panelists in academia. So this is telling us that where scientists get their information in the second half of this year will be very important to them. So again, this was also a top barrier at the beginning of this year, and we had gotten a question during the webinar in January about what kinds of topics are being politicized. We hadn't asked a follow-up at that point because it was such a new topic to our study, but because of that question, we did follow up with our panel in the study this time around. And so now we have insights around what kinds of scientific topics our panelists believe are being politicized. And again, this was an open response question, so our panelists could write in whatever they wanted. And their responses mostly fell into 3 buckets. So the first was climate change, and there was some frustration around this misinformation that scientists are seeing coming from, as they put it, non-professionals. And then the second topic that was often mentioned was vaccines. So scientists believe this has kind of continued post-COVID and has now spread to various kinds of vaccines. And then this third bucket of responses was much broader. And our panelists talked about just general science being politicized and polarizing. And I'll read that middle quote because we think that that really captures the overall sentiment here. Vaccine effectiveness, climate change, reproduction are all examples of scientific topics getting politicized in the current climate. They have impacted how society sees science and scientists, and that impacts my work. So again, there's this lack of trustworthy information when it comes to these topics. And we're seeing that in other responses too, to this question of top barriers in life sciences. So our scientists think that another top barrier in the second half of this year will be untrustworthy information, specifically in published papers. So at the beginning of last year, this was not often selected. And then we saw a spike in the second half of last year. It dropped a little bit at the beginning of this year, and now we're seeing the influence of untrustworthy information increase again. So through these kind of perceived barriers in life sciences, we know that access to trustworthy information is important, but it's also a challenge. So then, the natural next question is, where are scientists going to get information that they do trust? And this was also a question we asked for the first time in this study, and we captured scientists' sources of trustworthy information, specifically when it comes to their disease area, their specialization, or just the industry as a whole. So if we just focus on the sources that were selected most often, those most trusted sources, it's interesting that untrustworthy information in published papers was actually a top barrier. But 83% of our panel is still looking to publications for trusted information. So what really unites these trusted sources is the reassurance of peers. So scientists specifically trust peer-reviewed publications. They trust people in their network. They trust their professional association. So it's those personal connections that really build trust in information. And then when we look at our least trusted sources, we see AI tools like ChatGPT show up, even though, like Natalie walked us through, AI adoption and AI integration are clearly top priorities for scientists in the second half of this year. So what this is telling us is that scientists see an opportunity for AI to really streamline their workflows and help improve productivity. But this is separate from AI's ability, or lack thereof, to actually provide information. So when trying to connect with this audience, especially through AI, there needs to be a clear distinction between AI integrated technologies that are able to build on current capabilities and generative AI that actually provides new information. Because, as we see here, there is still a lot of doubt in generative AI specifically as an information source. And then here we have one more strategic consideration that just comes out of this idea of building trust. As we move into the second half of the year, over half of our panelists in biopharma are saying that for them, presentations and panels at industry events like conferences are a key source of trustworthy information about, their industry. And this is 20 points higher than the proportion of their counterparts in academia. So know that for the biopharma audience, they are really resonating with those conference presentations and those panels, and know that those are a worthy investment for connecting with this audience. So now we kind of have a more holistic view of the priorities, productivity, expectations, what scientists will need from external partners, what they're predicting will impact the industry. So in the second half of our conversation, we'll talk about how purchasing behavior and economic outlooks kind of fit into this ecosystem. And overall, we're seeing that scientists' economic outlooks are becoming less extreme, like Natalie alluded to at the beginning. You might remember that we reported in January that certain regions and certain sectors had especially optimistic or especially pessimistic views on the economy. And so now we're seeing that stabilize a little bit. And another key difference from January has been this shift in priorities. So usually our scientists' economic outlook determines how they say they're preparing for the next 6 months. But we're actually seeing those priorities of new funding sources and in-house capabilities kind of transcend economic outlooks. So again, here we have our key indicators. These are just summarizing our scientists' approach to the economy and to purchasing decisions in the second half of 2024. So just starting in the top left there, the proportion of biopharma who is purchasing more consumables, specifically because they need more data, has increased 20 points since January. Then 70% of our overall panel thinks that the cost of consumables will increase in the next 6 months, but 82% of our overall panel still actually plans to either maintain or to increase the consumables and the everyday lab products that they're buying. And then finally, we're seeing more cohesiveness in how scientists are preparing for the second half of the year. So across economic outlooks, this group's top priority will be applying for new sources of funding. So we'll just start here by talking more in depth about purchase intent, because at the beginning of this year, we were seeing the lowest Q1 purchase intent for new technologies yet. And it still went down in the second half of the year as expected. So these scientists weren't necessarily delaying purchases until later in the year. They were actually, well, and still are, being very intentional and very careful about the technologies that they're choosing to spend their resources on with things like sequencers. So instead, if we look at consumables and reagents, 70% of our scientists, again, that we spoke with, are expecting costs to increase in consumables in the next 6 months. So as a whole, the industry is expecting to spend more here on everyday lab products. But even though those prices are predicted to increase, our scientists are still planning to maintain, again, their purchases of everyday lab products or increase them. So you can see here that right now, as of July 2024, 46% of our panel will at least purchase the same amount of consumables as they did in the last year. And 36% will increase those purchases on some level slightly to significantly. So again, this is another signal of this need to be more intentional with purchasing decisions that scientists are experiencing in the second half of this year. So one of the reasons that scientists are making careful purchasing decisions and some of those trade-offs, especially in biopharma, is to maximize data collection in their projects. So at the beginning of this year, a requirement for more data collection was the top reason for increasing purchases of everyday lab products like consumables. And that was true for both academia and biopharma. But then when we ask again, halfway through this year, the proportion of biopharma specifically who is saying that, again, a need for more data is driving increased consumables purchasing, that has increased 20 points since January, which, as you might expect, it's not often we see increases at that level. So biopharma's projects and their workflows are asking even more of them for the second half of the year. So now what we'll do is look at the economic factors that are impacting scientists' sentiments and their expectations for the second half of 2024. And we'll see that when we look at the overall economic outlook for the full sample, it looks very similar to what we found in January. where there's kind of a pretty even split between those who expect recession and those who expect economic stability or for growth. But as we alluded to earlier, if we look at the data regionally and by industry, sorry, if we could go back, just alluding, we'll see that certain segments' economic outlooks start to become kind of less extreme. So here, again, this is economic outlook overall. There's still some uncertainty, but that gray part of the bar that represents those predicting recession in the second half of 2024, we're seeing that shrink a little bit. And the proportion predicting economic stability has increased since January. So that's where we're starting to see kind of this trend of economic stabilization overall. Now we can go to the next one. Thank you. So when we look at economic outlook by region, we're kind of continuing to see this stabilization trend, specifically in Europe. Because in January, our panelists in Europe were demonstrating the most negative economic outlook. So our European respondents had the highest proportion of panelists who were predicting recession in the first half of the year. So now that we're halfway through the year, economic outlooks in Europe specifically seem to be becoming less extreme. So we're seeing that in that 22-point overall decrease in those predicting recession. And then we also captured where they're getting their information, what exactly is impacting those outlooks. So for both North America and Europe, those more positive economic outlooks are coming actually from external news sources outside of the industry. So for these panelists, what they're seeing in just general finance news and general stock market news is signaling growth in the economy for the second half of 2024. And then if we look at economic outlooks broken out by academia versus biopharma, we're again seeing that stabilization. So in both segments, the proportion of panelists who are expecting stability, again, meaning just no significant change in economic conditions, that has increased. So again, these outlooks are becoming less extreme, less polarized. Also, you can see here too that the economic outlook in biopharma is slightly more positive than in academia, and that was true in January as well. And biopharma also had the most positive economic outlook in January, like I said. And at that point, this segment was using personal experience as a signal of economic growth. So at the beginning of the year, biopharma was seeing their own budgets increase. They were seeing their colleagues' budgets increase. And to them, they were taking that as a sign that the economy would improve in the next 6 months. So now that it's 6 months later, the proportion of panelists selecting each of those options has actually decreased 9 points. So at this point, we can say that personal experience and budget increases are not a driver for positive economic outlooks in biopharma. So instead, our panelists in biopharma who are predicting economic growth are using, again, those external news sources to inform that outlook. So the same was true for North America, for Europe, when we looked at this data broken out by region. So biopharma is really focused on both general financial news and industry-specific financial news when they are gathering information and making economic predictions. And so we can't necessarily extrapolate that the budget increases that we saw at the beginning of the year aren't there, but we can say that they are no longer a signal of economic growth for this audience specifically. So again, scientists' economic outlooks are stabilizing, they're becoming less extreme, and the actionable implication here is that this means priorities in life sciences, specifically in how panelists are preparing for the next 6 months, are becoming more cohesive. And we actually ask our panelists 2 questions about their priorities. One of them, Natalie covered earlier in our discussion, and that was more general. And the other, we asked specifically about how scientists are currently preparing for the next 6 months based on their economic outlook. And those responses are what you see here. And usually these responses in how scientists are preparing for the next 6 months are completely different based on their economic outlook. So scientists who predict a recession are usually preparing in a totally different way than those who are predicting economic growth, for example. But now, regardless of if these scientists are predicting recession, no economic change, or growth in the next 6 months, their priorities are largely the same. So they're preparing by applying for new sources of funding, and they're looking to bring more work in-house. So in the second half of 2024, scientists will be making decisions and purchases, and they'll be looking for partnerships that enable those two key actions. So with that, I think Kristin's going to take us through some final thoughts. Oh, Kristin, you're on mute.
Yes. Hi. Thanks, Erin. So first, I just want to mention we will be taking questions at the end of this discussion. So Catherine, I see yours up there. We'll get to that when we conclude. So please feel free to use the Zoom enabled function to enter in some questions, and we'll be going through those. We have just a few more slides just to wrap up and talk a little bit about some perspective and some final thoughts. We've been talking a lot about AI, not the entire presentation. However, it's important to know kind of what our perspective is and kind of what we're seeing from the data and where we think it's headed. So, in the beginning of the year in January, we were starting to see this transition from manual processes to automation integration. And that's where we are right now. As we move through the first half of the year and finally get to the end of 2025, that's where we really are starting to, where we predict to see a lot of AI enablement. And that will be the primary driver of how work is getting done. Of course, there'll be still manual processes, but that automation integration and, we'll be working smarter and better with AI enablement. One of the things that we do want to caution, because I know a lot of you that are on the line are working on offering AI capabilities with your services, we really need to navigate this tension and its implications. And so what we mean by this, and it really is language here and really understanding and describing and messaging what your services offer. So when we asked our audience about AI tools, the words, and using those words, generative AI, it's really still a source of doubt. So on that left-hand side, you can see that 12% are really viewing AI tools as a trusted source of information. Skepticism, we all know, we've been trying it, right? You pull up something and you Google it and you get this random response from AI. That's what we're talking about from this still a source of doubt. On the right-hand side, there's a real opportunity for impact with AI integrated tools. So 35% of our respondents are planning to prioritize adopting machine learning or AI in the second half of 2024. We only, and I'm sure you all agree, only know that number will grow. Erin alluded, and also Natalie talked a lot about trust. And we've been talking about trust for the past year or so, and as one of the sort of implications and how credible our industry is, we know that we have the proof points. However, there is a lot of skepticism, and the number 2 source of untrustworthy information is in this published papers. That's the second most selected barrier in life sciences today, and Erin talked about it. However, we're looking to those peer-reviewed scientific publications as a source of trustworthy information. And then up 20 points in this study is the presentations and panels at industry events. So, at the end of COVID, we all joked and said, our conference is going to go away. And the answer to that, as you all know, as you're seeing this data and what you've probably been experiencing, is the answer is no. They're even more important. And that's where the connections are happening, that face-to-face interaction. The presentations that you're all giving at these conferences are so important. As a side note, our team at Linus, we've been spending a lot of time thinking about Charles Duhigg's latest book, Super Communicators, and being able to build those connections and really sort of establish that trust, getting to know our customers and getting to know your audience so that we can really sort of maximize that connection. So trust, conferences, and having those one-on-one conversations. Transition this to a little bit about multi-omics, and it's something that we've been talking about this year as well as last year. We're really seeing an increase in activity here and it come to life. From the new collaborations to purchase intent, across across life sciences, sequencers, as Natalie was talking about, are the top technology scientists are planning to purchase in the second half of this year. And then finally, number 3, that new technology. So new offerings in this space are beginning to provide this perspective beyond DNA, including multi-omics analysis. So really great news from that perspective and advancing science forward. Erin talked a lot about the economy and, yes, from our respondents' perspective, it's stabilizing. However, cost increases are really still expected. Scientists are going to need to be more intentional, and they expect to be more intentional with budgeting and purchasing decisions. So, they will still be applying for new sources of funding. 29% are planning to bring more work in-house to reduce costs. But it's still, this is an important slide and an important metric just to keep in mind as we're going to market and talking to our customers and really understanding their behavior as well. Okay, finally, to wrap it up, and again, please ask some questions. We have some coming in already. We're looking at the transition from automation to AI continuing with a lot expected to happen at the end of this year as we move into 2025. Second, please remember this discussion about and this distinction about generative AI and AI integrated tools. Again, wording is really important for our audience. 3, trust. Talked a lot of trust. We know how to establish that trust, and it's by building connections with our audience. And then 4, scientists' expectations for impact and purchasing behavior really highlights this growing interest in multi-omics. And then finally, 5, we know things are becoming less extreme, and it's no longer a determinant of scientific priorities, which we think is really great news. And that's what we have to share with you today. So we'll start taking some questions. And so our first question is from Catherine Webster. Thank you. And I'll read this, and then either Erin or Natalie, feel free to chime in. So the question is, are the politicization of topics affecting how scientists approach how they write their grant applications? Do they feel they need to be more conservative in their descriptions of their research goals to have a better chance of receiving grants? Either of you have thoughts on this? I know it's not something we specifically asked, but we do talk to a lot of different scientists.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I can start and Erin can jump in. I think what they're referring to is more about communicating with the general public than they are with the technical audiences that are reviewing their grant proposals. And so I think grant proposals and the technical language that they're using when communicating with their peers remains very similar. It's thinking about the impact that the external environment has perhaps on influencing people. So it's a good question though, and it's a good consideration. If those that are reviewing grant proposals are influenced by the media and the skepticism, perhaps there should be whether it's training for reviewers or thought put into how you're presenting your research in those grant proposals. But we did not explore that, as you mentioned, Kristin. We did not ask that specific question, but it's certainly something we could consider asking our audience in the future.
Yeah,
Erin?
I'll just echo that. I think there was an exasperation expressed with kind of how science, like vaccines, like climate change, like general science, has kind of been positioned in the general public. But I think Natalie has a great point. The people reviewing grants are a part of the general public as well. And so if we need to consider that this kind of frustration is permeating more than just scientific relationships with the public. So yes, I think that's a great point, and I think something to explore.
We have a question here from an anonymous attendee. Do you have a sense of what technologies they're relying upon to bring work in-house, assuming that they're looking to tech solutions given the early slides about staff shortages?
Yes, so similar to last year, the top workflow that scientists are expecting to bring in-house is assay development. So over half of our panel is saying that they plan to bring assay development in-house. We think a lot of this has to do with kind of this importance of trust that we're talking about in the next 6 months. That's obviously especially impactful because so much of their work is contingent on the success of an assay. So these scientists want control over the development of their assays. Stability testing and target identification were also selected by about a third of our panel. So these will often be moving in-house in the next 6 months as well.
Good. Here's another question. How do you see the purchases for basic consumables like syringes and buffers look for the next 2 years? Will the market still be volatile, or is the economic stabilization going to be long-term? Gosh, I'm not sure we can answer the second part of that question. However, the first part potentially we can answer.
Yes, we can give you an answer for the next 6 months. We're seeing stability. I mean, almost half of our panel is saying they're going to purchase almost the same amount of consumables that they have been in the last year. But, you know, I think it was 36%. We're also saying that we're going to increase purchases. So we'll continue to ask every 6 months and give you an update. But at least for the next 6 months, we're sensing a lot of stability, if not increase for consumables.
Great question. Don't we all wish we could predict that far out? Good. Those are all the questions. Thank you. Oh, here's one more. Thank you, Kelly. For which applications is AI integration anticipated to be the priority?
That's a great question. I think if I were to guess, I think there's a strong signal towards bioinformatics, which is perhaps not surprising given that that's already an in silico technique that's happening. So we see a lot of excitement around the bioinformatics opportunities with AI, but I'm not sure that we've asked specifically about the lab techniques that might have AI automation incorporated. Erin, would you agree with that?
Well, we know that AI integration is a top priority, and we also did ask about the top 5 technologies that scientists are currently using. So if we want to cross-tab a little bit, the top 5 technologies that these scientists are currently using and also prioritizing AI in the background, antibody-based protein detection, cell and tissue culture, animal models, microscopy, and PCR. Obviously, not all of those workflows are going to be AI related, but we can assume that either upstream or downstream, there will be some kind of AI, at least consideration in those technology areas.
Great. Yeah, digital pathology definitely comes to mind there.
Good. Well, oh, another one. I'm always trying to end, but please, the questions are great. And so I think, so this next one, do you feel that with an election year, this anonymous attendees, we're predicting the future. Do you feel that with an election year upon us, that there could be a shift in scientific focus in 2025?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that the administration certainly impacts facets of the environment that the scientific community operates in, right? So if we think about the current FDA work to try to have more control and oversight of laboratory developed tests. If the administration changes, that could become less of a priority, and the impact of that on the industry could certainly change. So while certainly science operates regardless of the politics that are happening in our world, the environment that we all have to align with is impactful. And so depending on the outcome of this election, and if an administration change, an administration change will happen, as we learned recently this week. But if a party change happens, for example, it's likely that the regulatory oversight or some of the different agency work may change. So yes, it's possible that it could impact the state of science for 2025.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, Natalie, or something similar. And as we look at some of the recent organizations that have been stood up in the last couple of years in the Biden administration, for example, like ARPA-H, Dr. Wegrazin's organization that's doing phenomenal work and bringing new science, new innovation, new medications, and speeding the pathway to launch. We can only hope that that will stay regardless of administration. But again, that's just a thought. Thank you all. Please feel free to reach out. This has been a really great conversation. We've seen a lot of attendees participate from across the globe. So thank you so much for spending the last 47 minutes with us. We will be sharing these slides to those that registered for the webinar, and they will be posted. The webinar will be posted on our website as well. So thank you so much. Please feel free to reach out if there's anything specifically you need. You want more data? We have a lot of data and a lot that we could have shared with you today. So if there's something that's on your mind, please feel to reach out. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.